UTism.
After 2 days of intensive discussion on religion, we now know for sure that we don't know what it is, or how it works, or whether it's good or not. But we are fairly confident that it somehow sits at the very root of our ability to make meaning and live in the world that we exist in, or at least has for almost everybody for almost all of history. So it's this incredibly central, important feature of our cognition and our lives that we have very little understanding of, and we're still struggling towards descriptive adequacy for this phenomenon. I think we can identify a few, I'm going to take my moderator's privilege and ask the first question of the panel. I can discern at least 3 sort of positive proposals that came out of the talks. One from Tom McNeill, who sort of gently suggested that maybe we could be engineering our religions using the results of cognitive science. One from John Vervaeke, who was sort of neutral with respect to religion. Religio, which is, I take it, neither strongly pro nor anti-organized religion, but somewhere in between, and we think we can use cognitive science to inform that. And one from, Jim Davies, who actually suggested that cognitive science can provide us with a kind of psychic immune system, which I took your meaning to be something like, not anti-religious, but certainly to reduce the credulity that we bring to bear with respect to religion. So we've got these at least 3 positive proposals, and most of the rest of the talks were descriptive. And most of the people trying to do the empirical work of describing religion agreed that we don't know what it is yet. And particularly, we haven't identified all the factors that tell us whether it would be a positive or negative thing for a person. And I thought Joni Sasaki's talk this morning underlined that beautifully, that you need to look at the interaction of biology and culture and your specific situation. So my question to the panel, my broad, rambling question is, should we be engaging in these normative projects before we even sort of achieve the descriptive adequacy that we might want for the phenomena? Is that a wise thing to be doing? And I feel like this is a broad theme on many of the questions that I've gotten a chance to look at so far. People want to know, what should we be doing about this stuff? Jordan Peterson very beautifully made a distinction between the sort of space of things, which might be the objective scientific inquiry into things, and the space of actions. And most of the questions that you all seem to have been asking were about the space of action. What do we do about this stuff?
I'll say something. I think that you can start to have normative ideas as soon as you start collecting descriptive data, and you should base your normativity on the best information that science has available so far. So the idea that we should wait until we understand religion before we have any suggestions about it sounds like a long time, or it's hard to know when we would actually be satisfied that we know enough to say anything. So I think they have to go in tandem.
I would say that yes, you should wait, but you can't. Well, that's exactly it. It's like, you should wait till you know what you're doing to act. So well, good luck with that.
I would say that part of this might be solved by thinking a little bit more about definition. I think we haven't been using religion with the same meaning all the way across the panel and in all the presentations. And there are some things that we've discussed that I think are definitely relevant to religion and maybe feed into it, but I wouldn't describe them as religion. For me, I think, so religion is a term of convenience, an academic term of convenience. We get to choose what it describes for the purpose of better understanding. It's not like there's some essential thing out there that is religion that comes with that name. So for me, I think it's that in terms of knowledge acquisition, building knowledge, in terms of how we construct our questions, I think it's most useful to reserve religion as an emergent category, rather than some of these individual behaviors we were discussing, rather than some of the cognitive underpinnings of it. I think religion exists at an emergent level. And I think if we could begin with a shift of the term to that level, it would help us get a little, we still wouldn't know exactly what it was, but we'd have more clarity on the field we were examining.
Yeah, you guys
Just one more, a definitional issue here. You can't define religion using a proper set, but you can define it using a family resemblance category. Now, if you diagnose someone with a mental illness, you use a family resemblance category. And the way those work is, here's 20 features of schizophrenia. If you have any 5 of them, you're schizophrenic, which means that schizophrenic A can have 5 symptoms that schizophrenic B doesn't have, yet they're both schizophrenic. And that's the appropriate categorical structure to use to define something as amorphous as religion. It doesn't mean it can't be categorized. It just means that there are all sorts of different systems of categorization and you have to pick the right one. So technically that's a family resemblance category. So, and it's hard to be scientific about a family resemblance category. But that doesn't mean they're not categories. They're perfectly reasonable categories.
Thanks, Mike. There's a presupposition in the question I want to challenge. I know that's a shocking thing for me to do. And I guess there's the implication that the discussion of religion is somehow hanging free from the normativity. But many of our important norms that are becoming really central again to us, like the norm of wisdom that's been brought up a couple times, to try to somehow feel we could peel that away from the discussion of religion. And so it's almost like your question is like, what should we do about normativity? Which that strikes me like what's north of the North Pole. I don't know where you go to try and get a place to, there was a presupposition of trying to start that in some way. And I think it's like we're always thrown into the middle of the normativity self-questioning project.
Right. If Jordan's proposal that there's a normativity sort of part of our basic ontological furniture, that's got to be the case.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
I don't know if John will agree with whether he agree. Whether I and he agree. But anyway, my sense is don't worry about the descriptive project or the normative project in the sense that don't worry about what we think about religion. I think what we should do is take the religious traditions to be a historical record of people's wrestling with normative questions, especially big normative questions. And what cognitive science should take from this is we should take seriously the mind's wrestling with enormous normative questions. So we should take what religious traditions do seriously and not worry about judging the category.
I would agree with that.
You would.
Okay, well, I consider myself answered.
A rare moment. John and I don't always agree. So.
No, take note.
Okay, so let's. Oh, sorry, one more. Yeah.
I think it's extremely interesting that 250 people were that interested in religion to come to this and cognitive science, to come to this symposium. I think we should ask you what brought you. There is something in the subject itself that's compelling, obviously, and I think that's a very big answer right there. If none of us defined it, fine. It's still operating in the curiosity and the openness of the minds of all these people, all of you folks present. I'm very impressed with that.
So there was, I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to read every question. There was a ton of great questions. So I'm going to try to draw out some of the themes of the questions. And there seems to have been a great concern about how our relationship with religion is going to be changing over time. So this one is, will religion die out this century? How about organized religion in particular? And immediately after that, in very similar handwriting, why isn't there a secular, scientifically based religion? John, what's holding you up? So I do. So to put a point a little bit finer, is there something particular about our moment in history vis-a-vis our relationship with religion, or are we just sort of playing out the same schemas that we have for millennia?
Yeah, that's a neat question. Here's what I see. There's a couple different things working. One is religion has costs. I think in the past, people have been willing to pay those costs because they needed tight-knit groups. You know, they had to be part of the tribe. I have a friend of mine who's a wonderful atheist, and we would have these science and religion Thursday night lunch or Thursday lunch things that we would do. And I would tell him, look, if you go back, 10,000 years, you'd be dancing around the fire with everyone else, even if you didn't believe it. Why? Because you had to. You had to be part of the group. You got important benefits from being part of the group. Atheists today don't have to dance around the fire anymore because they can get they can get the benefits that you used to derive from very close-knit, tight communities that were bonded by religion. They can get that from other sources. They can get it from government, they can get it from the marketplace, they can get it from the internet and all that kind of stuff. So you can opt out a lot easier. So I think that's one force going. You can opt out of the ritual costs, and you can sleep in on Sunday morning rather than going to church and that sort of thing. So that makes religion more expensive for most people, and they'd rather just drop out of it. Along with the fact that a lot of people have problems with the belief propositions and all that kind of stuff. But the other force that you have operating, which is interesting, is that I think as societies get more secularized, religion becomes more and more of an alternative lifestyle. And so you could potentially see more and more religions, things that we think of as mainstream religions, like Catholicism or Presbyterianism or whatever, looking more like what the Amish look like to us. In other words, a very distinct community, very different, offering a very completely distinct kind of way of approaching life compared to what the secular norm is, which might be attractive to a fair amount of people. Also, and we've seen this with the Amish and with a lot of these other sorts of groups, when they become more distinct and more separate, it's often very much the case that their reproductive rates go up quite dramatically. So they start reproducing quite well. Secular folks have a real problem reproducing. You've seen this across societies that become increasingly secularized. Their birth rates just go down like mad. One of the reasons for that, I think, is because it takes a lot of tight-knit, close-knit social support to do well in terms of reproduction. You've got to have others around you that you can trust. Religious communities can provide that quite well. So, what's going to happen in the future? I don't know, because you've got these two opposing forces. One is, people don't like to pay the costs anymore of ritual participation, but higher reproduction rates are probably going to be the case for religious communities compared to secular communities. Who's going to win out? I don't know. But I'm talking too much. But
sorry.
The death of religion has been proclaimed for centuries. It hasn't happened, so I kind of doubt it.
But I'd like to add something to this, if I could. I'm scared shitless of the rise of the religious right. I just want to say that. And here's the problem. I don't think a lot of people find late neo-capitalism and a kind of philosophy of mechanism to constitute a sense of life worth living. And I think there's a pretty profound hunger for something else that will give people guidance with respect to who to take home at night and who to marry and what to stand in front of bulldozers for and stuff. And my worry is that the religious right is answering that question with terrible answers, xenophobic answers, violent answers, all this kind of stuff, terrifying answers. But I feel like if those of us who are progressive, those of us on the left, those of us who are intellectuals, those of us who have some understanding of the brain, all this kind of stuff, if we can't provide a framework of life that answers questions better than capitalism and pure mechanism about what's worthwhile, we're going to lose.
Yeah, I started my project as a raving atheist, and I've softened a lot over the course of study. And there is a theory out there, and it might be wrong, But it's that religion actually evolved to be a pro-social force that keeps groups together. And that theory could be incorrect. But what frightens me is that I no longer think that if you wiped religion off the face of the earth, it would suddenly be a better place. Now I'm scared of what might happen if we took it out without replacing it. And just like it would be really hard to get rid of sex and have people reproduce a different way, even if we thought it was better, I think that all of these struggles to create a replacement, a secular replacement for religion, that's Alain de Botton, for example, is supporting, are going to have a real uphill battle if they're possible at all.
So the question was, is there something unique about the current circumstances? One answer is no, because we've always been stuck with the problem of revivifying the dead. It's a chronic religious problem, because culture's always dead, because it's the past, and you have to bring it back to life in order for it to function. So in that sense, it's the same old thing. But in another sense, there's something really new, which is we've, in some sense, suffered through the conflict between science and religion. Now, it's still playing out. It's part of what underlies the emergent conflict between radical Islam and the rest of the world. But in the West, not only are we post-religious in some sense, we're also post-ideological. If you have any sense, you're post-ideological. That means you learned the lesson of the 20th century. So now if the religion, classic religion didn't work and the classic ideologies didn't work, we're sort of back to square one, because we tried totalitarianism and that didn't work, and it left us stuck with nihilism. And that isn't going to work either. So the alternative to nihilism and to totalitarianism is what you guys are doing in this conference, which is to try to figure out what the hell's going on without presuming that you already know. And that's, I think, partly why there's a genuine interest, once again, in the phenomenology of religion. It's because if your eyes are open and you don't have an a priori ideological theory to assume that the entire religious history of mankind is nonsense, the first thing you figure out is that you don't really understand anything about it, and that might be worth a look. And we need it. We need the look, because you need something deep to orient yourself in the face of suffering, and that never goes away. It never goes away. It's the primary existential problem of human beings. Now, we also know, like, the whole atheism argument to me is like, we finished that off in like 1895. You know, it's like, it's so old and boring that it's barely worth considering. We know perfectly well that you can reliably induce religious experiences. We know that they exist. All you need is the right chemicals. And so the fact that a category of religious experience exists is an indisputable fact. We also know that those experiences can be potent enough, even in single doses, to produce permanent radical transformations of personality. So the idea that there's a religious experience is indisputable. What we don't understand is what that means, and we also don't understand how that experience should be translated appropriately into rules of perception and conduct. But both of those things are eminently worth exploring, and like, they're real mysteries.
So that brings us to another one of the broad themes that was going across a number of the questions, which was the question of the relationship between individual versus collective pursuits of truth. So here's one that sort of gets it. What are your thoughts on the pursuit of truth as an individual versus a collective endeavor? Is it more productive to seek a unifying perspective on life and reality, or for individuals to seek their own meaning and context? I'm putting to mind of the Kalama Sutta from the Pali Canon, where the Buddha goes to a village where the people were in a state, I think, much like many of us, which is they've heard a lot of really excellent arguments that said different things and sometimes contradicted each other, and they didn't know what to think. They were thrown into a state of sort of confusion, and the Buddha's advice is, of course, see what works for you. Apply these things in your life and see what reduces your suffering. But that throws it back on you as an individual, and I don't know about you guys, I'm not always the best judge of what's going to reduce my suffering. I sometimes think that fourth drink is going to make me feel better, and it doesn't, right? So we seem to be, there's the sort of phenomenological, spiritual side of this stuff, which is this religious experience and the working out of the individual's relationship between their tiny, finite being and the infinite universe. But there's also this collective dimension, which seems to have historically been deeply, intimately interconnected with these things, and they seem to have fallen apart in some way for us. So you can have a deeply religious or deeply spiritual person with as a religion of one, which is a terrifying place to be. It satisfies the definition that John gave of horror yesterday, which is the feeling that reality is slipping away from you. To can be deeply alone with one of your sincerely held beliefs. I'm worried, and a number of these questions are worried about, have we lost something by losing the conformity that traditional structures of religion imposed? Maybe that was the best thing about them, was that we all sang the same songs and went to the same place on Sunday. And that's, I take it, the lesson of much of the stuff about ritual, was that pro-sociality. So what do we do about that? Do we try to reconstruct the conformity that religion imposed, or do we just sort of suffer as individual seekers after truth?
If you're seeking after truth properly, it will benefit the community. I mean, it depends on how you define truth, right? But I'm speaking from within the framework that I laid out earlier. Like, if your orientation is appropriate, and I mean, that's partly something you have to decide, you won't work perversely against the community while you explore for truth. And that has a lot to do with your own motivation, you know. And your motivation actually sets up the problem space. So I would say, is your own individual pursuit going to be antisocial or pro-social? And the answer to that would be, it depends on what the hell you want. And that would be, do you want things to be better? Or do you want things to be worse? And you know, you might think, well, I want things to be better, but like, you better think about 5 years before you make that decision, because there's a huge chunk of every person who would just assume that things went as rapidly as possible to the deepest corner of hell. So, and that's something that everyone, that's something that's characteristic of every single person's experience, and it's a very difficult thing to master.
I'm not sure that I have a direct answer, or I'm not sure that the things I want to say coalesce around this dichotomy between individual and collective. I think, in a way, what we're doing is struggling against our evolved limits. We're stuck with the set of skills that our ancient ancestors needed. And they don't serve us very well in our contemporary context. They were really great in tribal foraging sets of circumstances, but now we're in a very different setting. We can't evolve quickly enough as organisms to compensate. And so cultural evolution is the way we work with that, and religion is one of the things that helps us with that. Today I was thinking about the overlap between what was said about pragmatism and the relevance theory. I think religions are, in a way, deferral systems. We just don't have the bandwidth to figure everything out at any given moment of our lives. And we need to defer. It's the only way to manage most of life. And so healthy religious systems, the good enough of pragmatism, and the continual cultural evolution of responsiveness of relevance theory, I think are what would make a good religious system. That it doesn't harden. For me, ideology is the hardening of a system. And what we've been talking about in healthy religious systems is this responsiveness. I think one of our evolved limits is that we really do need each other. However much we give lip service to individuality, it's more or less, I'm just going to say it's a lie. It doesn't work, it's not true, it's not what's going on. Anyway, but I think that the idea of religion as a deferral system that's responsive, that's about good enoughness, that continues cultural evolution, that compensates for the limits of our evolved capacities as an organism. That's the direction I'd go. And then I think we need to talk about content things that Brian and others were interested in, the category of ultimacy.
Sorry, I just want to object to part of that.
Go ahead.
The last part I don't want to object to at all, but I really want to object to the idea that our nervous systems are outdated. It's like, they're not outdated. We're not equipped with, a set of systems that were designed on the African tribe or the African veldt and that no longer serve us. It's like, I really believe that's absolute rubbish. And the reason I believe that, at least in part, is because I think that we're adapted for the distinction between explored and unexplored territory, and that never, ever goes away. Those are the permanent constituent elements of reality. There's what you know and what you don't know. And some of the systems that we use to deal with that have deep evolutionary roots, but that argues for their wisdom, not for their anachronism. And the idea that the prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that we should rely on most is absolutely, Christ, your brain won't let you run your heart with your prefrontal cortex, and that's because it's so damn dumb you drop dead. So old neurologically means wise, not unwise.
Actually, I'd like to disagree with Jordan too.
I don't think.
Otherwise, it would be boring.
Yeah, and I don't think he was disagreeing with that. What I said, that was a
Right.
completely different argument, but he was just agreeing.
Well, my worry is that that our brains evolved to be adaptive for survival, and I just want to register a tremendous worry about the recruitment of evolutionary metaphors and ideas of survival as actually getting at what matters. My own sense. So here's something I wrote in frustration during some talk, but I'm not going to tell you which one. But anyway.
I know which one.
Now, remember community, right? And supporting your neighbor. So here's what I wrote. I'm not even saying this is true. I kind of want it to be true, but I think it's worth reading. It isn't religion, or at least it isn't what religion is about, until it doesn't have a selfish explanation or a merely instrumental application, including tribally selfish explanation or tribally instrumental application. The step into faith is what happens when you let go of all that, including a loss of self, a loss of sense of tribal self and stuff, in order to grant the world its own significance, not its significance for you. So that was just my Tourette's spurt in response to this tremendous, and it's not just you, Jordan, I mean, this tremendous tendency in the university at the moment to recruit evolution as a source of human normativity. I just think, I don't know, I don't want to go there.
Well, I thought I'd like to get back to the question, I think, which is,
The collective versus individual.
yeah, can you pursue truth individually, or does it have to be done? I think if you look both at great scientists and at great religious leaders, mystics and whatever, you see both. Because there's a role for going off quietly, doing individual contemplation, and trying to come to insights through that. You need that. You need quiet time. You need to contemplate. But that then has to be brought to the community. Because others will have done that same thing and will have had insights, and they may not be exactly the same. And then there has to be some kind of dialogue and discussion within the community. So I think both are essential.
One of the most reliable features of religious or mystical experience is the felt need to tell somebody about it. You just gotta rush out and tell them, I saw God, all right. Yes, right.
I just wanted to, staying on the question and reinforce what Colleen said, I think one of the things that's coming out of developmental psychology in a powerful way is the erosion of the distinction between the individual and the collective. The idea of distributed cognition, the idea of networking, is pretty much sort of becoming. We're moving towards a consensus that it's pretty scale invariant. I mean, there's important questions because this network seems to have consciousness and these networks don't. But I don't want to skip over that. But the idea that there's some clean line, right, that is at the end of the skull between sort of collective processing and individual processing, I mean, that's just not right. I mean, like, the idea that even that there's a boss in your brain where it all comes together, right? Like there's an individual in the heart of your brain. I mean, that's just false, right? And I mean, we like that idea because it gives us the magical belief that we can somehow step out of the causal world and step back in when we need to. And I mean, it's distributed cognition all the way in and all the way out. And how I even relate to my own self metacognitively, I get from how she has looked at my cognition. I didn't generate it myself. I didn't generate this language I'm speaking. I think the distinction should be abandoned as being an important way to frame this question. What we need to talk about is how do these networks work? And I agree with Brian, we have to keep that question distinct as what do we want them to be working for? So that's how I would answer that.
Further responses to that?
Wow.
So, we'll go broader than this. Let's see what else we got. There are some truly bizarre questions. There are some really fun questions. Given what was stated in the talks, or otherwise, how should we act? Please put your answer in the form of an entire discipline. How about something a little more specific? All right. So, what should the people in this room today do in the next 5 to 10 years to address what, in your view, are the most pressing collective action problems humanity faces in history? And will that involve becoming less religious or more, basically? So this is a sort of continuation of the previous question, in that we're now asking our collective action questions like, should we let people pollute in the river? Well, if you call it a sacred river that's sacred to all of us, probably not, but without that kind of homogenization that religion has traditionally provided, how do we get a grip on these collective action problems? Like, can we do this without the tribalism that traditional religions have imposed on us?
I spoke last. Is it okay if I speak first? Is that trespassing? No, I'm willing to give the mic over if somebody has a more urgent thing to say. I mean, I agree with Jordan. I think it's that we're in a meaning crisis. I mean, there are always, I mean, when this particular thing, there are always perennial problems. Humans always face perennial problems of absurdity and alienation and horror. And that's not unique to our time. But human beings have traditionally had overarching, worldview machinery that helped us significantly ameliorate and deal with those perennial problems. And that machinery is breaking down. I mean, we have this kind of mental health crisis, and we've got this existential crisis. I mean, we've got this rising mythology of the zombie, which represents meaninglessness and the perversion of community and drifting through life. And don't forget, the way you make a zombie is just have us decay, right? And so the culture is like reeling right now. So I'm of the opinion that meaning crisis is inextricably bound up with the other crises we're facing, the environmental crisis, the energy crisis, the economic crisis. And that if we don't get on trying to address the meaning crisis and try to tackle these other crises independently, we're going to be thwarted to some significant degree. Now, I'm not saying we should abandon our political efforts. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is if we don't take into account the way the meaning crisis is driving these other crises, often in an invisible manner, we're not going to get the kind of success we need because of the urgency we're facing. So I think we need to make this more central to our analysis of the looming cataclysm we're facing. So we have about 10, 15 years. That's about it.
That seems reasonable to me, because the question is, what's the central problem? And I thought, much like John has, about the central problem actually being a crisis of meaning. The question is, what can you do about it in your own lives? And I think there's two things that you can do. They're both very difficult. I think one of them is you can decide whether what you know or what you don't know is your friend. And I would pick what you don't know. There's a lot more of it. You're going to encounter a lot more of it in your life than what you do know. And if you make it into your friend, then you have an inexhaustible source of replenishment. And it also makes you able to listen to other people on the off chance they might know something you don't and be, decent enough to share it with you. It's very difficult to learn that. The other thing I would say is that you should strive very, very diligently within your own life to cease uttering and acting out falsehoods. I could say pursue the truth, but the problem with that is everyone always objects, well, what's the truth? It's like, okay, fine, fair enough. Just quit doing what you know to be lies. That'll do the trick. And if you do that diligently, it'll change you. And the way it will change you is that it will make you more powerful and more persuasive and more properly oriented. And if you want to solve any real problems, you bloody well better make sure you're not more trouble than the problem. And there are lots of people who think that they could dictate the energy policy for the earth, some of them probably sitting in this room who haven't got the foggiest idea how they might run a single electrical motor. So, you know, you also have to distinguish between what you know and what you don't know and where your competencies actually are. And I would say, start by solving problems that are your size. Believe me, they'll be hard enough to solve, you know. See if you can make your family a little more peaceful. That'll keep you going for a few years. You know, well, enough said.
I'd like to throw a footnote in here, back to Jim Corse's talk. I think, with respect to the question, one thing to do is not be ideological, in his sense, about the R word, either pro or con.
Which word?
A certain word starting with R, I think originally etymologically it had to do with drawing together. And so mentioned a few times.
I just didn't hear you.
So here's one from somebody looking for tips on designing a cult. They say, if a new religion were born today, what properties would you personally like it to have? Because it's interesting because we've got, I take it that we're just now beginning to get a little bit of an empirical grasp on what makes religions go, what makes them compelling, what makes them make us. Would you make them more compelling or less? I mean, does compellingness, for example, drive ideology? Clearly we would want to make them an infinite game rather than a finite game. You'd want to have an open epistemology rather than a closed one, I think. I think that's most of us. But are there any more specifics? Like, how would you, if you got to make up your own religion, let's start a cult, guys, let's do this. What features would you want it to have?
I'd like it to funnel a lot of money to me.
As is traditional.
I'd like to start with a better human race.
That's not bad. Better human rights.
Well, I guess it's opposite actually, but I throw my hat in with utilitarianism, but I also am very, I'm pretty sure that any religion that is completely utilitarian won't last. So you need to keep creating them. I think a religion needs to have a self-perpetuating to the exclusion of others ethos in it to get any historical traction.
So I'd say, I mean, we've been talking about not hardening things, and so we need ironic hymns. We would need that. All unity would have to have irony in it. I think if we want to capture what we've been talking about, that would need to be, I'm not saying this is what I want.
Oh Lord, you're doing fine, there's some things you missed kind of stuff.
Hipster religion.
Yeah. Okay. This is the right time and place for that.
Yeah, it is. I actually think one of the things that's been lost in the meaning crisis that probably needs to be retrieved, and it's come up a number of times, is a sense of sanctity. There's been some work, and again, Jonathan Haidt has been mentioned a few times, in this idea of moral drives, the sense that there are it's moral foundation theory is Haidt, that there are drives within human beings that are then elaborated within specific cultures into morals and values, and one of them is sanctity and degradation. And I think that there's been a profound loss of a sense of sanctity in the cell phone age.
I hadn't noticed that at all.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of what's being retrieved. I mentioned Zizek before, and he talks about the way there were some folk songs that were just considered beautiful, and as people got more jaded and were against sentimentality and so on, some of those songs became nationalistic hymns. And that for him was an example of the way in which once a vacuum of ultimacy is created, other things can come in and claim it, using the same avenues, but substituting things that ought not to claim that territory. So an increase in sanctity, I think, is one of the things we have to figure out how to do again, after we've discovered that all meaning is generated rather than discovered.
So does the empirical work on ritual give us any hints on what creates an atmosphere of sanctity? Like, presumably there's some rituals that are profane, like going to the football game and just yelling and drunk, and there are some that are supposed to have this sort of quality of being sacred or having that sanctified air. Is there some...
With hates, we're, you're much more likely to elevate sanctity to the status of the divine if you're conservative. And that seems to be associated with conscientiousness and low openness. And conscientiousness is partly orderliness, and that seems to be associated with disgust sensitivity.
Right,
So-
I mean, I think he's doing really interesting work on trying to dissolve, again, the ideology of left and right and conservative and liberal. And I think the work that he and others are doing around that is very helpful. I mean, conservative conserves energy. It's good for cultures in that it takes less expenditure of energy to figure out we defer more often and so on. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting past the question. But I think his work around that is partly about disrupting the easy sensibilities around what's left and what's right, what's conservative and what's liberal. And I think that's really important work to be doing now too.
The meaning crisis is a funny thing because if you start to think about it, it kind of dissolves in some sense. So you might say, well, you can say, is anything meaningful? And I would say, well, you can say that all you want, but you don't believe it. It's like every time you're in pain, you don't think, well, is this real? It's like, obviously it's real and it's meaningful. And the same thing is the case when you're suffering, you're anxious, or you're grieving. You don't try undermining your sense of meaning in those situations. Well, I just cut off my hand, but nothing has any meaning. It's like, well, no. You can't undermine your own pain with your rational skepticism. You seem to be able to undermine a fair bit of your joy. But that's mostly arrogance. It's rational arrogance. If I started a religion, which I would absolutely never want to do, the first thing I might propose is quit thinking and start watching. If you watch yourself for 2 weeks, you can find out when what you're doing is meaningful. All you have to do is notice. So, and then I would say, once you notice what's meaningful, try doing some more of that. You know, maybe you can stretch it out 1% a month. If you do that for 5 years, you won't have any worries about meaning. Everything you do will be meaningful. And that'll be the end of that problem. So, it's, you know, modern people believe way too much in what they think. It's like, who the hell cares what you think? Most of what you think isn't yours anyways. You're just regurgitating dead philosophers. So it's much more important to pay attention to the manner in which your life manifests itself to you, and that is not a rational issue. So the meaning crisis is a consequence, at least in part, of our unbelievable privilege and irrationality. So you're just not that smart, man. Give it up.
Could I reply to that? And I'm not going to regurgitate a dead philosopher, I'm going to invoke a living one, Susan Wolf. And Susan Wolf talks about a particular issue, though, and this does seem to be borne out into the psychological research. People seem to have a very strong drive to be connected to something, and the metaphor initially is something bigger than themselves. And then she takes time to say, that's only a metaphor, because if I chain you to a mountain, you'll go, oh, wow, now I'm satisfied. So she gets at it, and she does a very careful analysis, and she said the problem seems to be we want to be connected to something that has a value independent of our valuing of it. And the problem with us is that seems to be a real drive, and yet our worldview says to us, there isn't anything that has a value independent of our valuing of us. And I mean, I'm not disagreeing with the existential imperative you're talking about, but that strikes me as a real problem. That strikes me as a legitimate issue. How do we come about, as she said, the problem is, how do you get subjective attraction to meet objective attractiveness when we no longer believe in objective attractiveness? And
Stop believing in the objective.
Well,
We haven't been believing in it for that long.
well, but are you then claiming in some sense that value is independent of our valuing of things?
I would say that the question can't be phrased that way. Because you could answer yes or no to it and be right. I think it's like saying, if you read a book, is the meaning in the book or in the reader?
Well,
It's like it's in the interaction between the two, and that's where meaning comes out of experience. So
okay, then I think I might be agreeing with you. I mean, I was one of the things I was trying to argue in the talk I gave about this idea about it's and it's coming out of the embodied cognition approach. The idea of sort of transductivity, that relevance isn't made by the world or by us, but by a coupling between them. But I mean, that takes a lot of important work to do. I mean, I'm trying to say that I think that work has to be done, and simply saying to people, sort of pay attention to how meaningful your day-to-day life is, still doesn't answer that question.
Could I get back to the question of starting a new religion?
Yep.
Just sitting here thinking about it, I don't think you can start a new religion. At least not one that's of any substance. I mean, you can start Jedi Knights and all, you know, all that crap. But, you know, here's what I would say to the folks out there. If you really want to start a new religion, first study the other religions, because you don't want to just reinvent the wheel, right? You can't do that in science. You can't just, you know, call a new theory by a different name and start doing. So the first thing you have to do, if you're going to start a new religion, is study the religions that are already present or have been present. And I think once you do that, you would be amazed at how rich and how complex and how many issues the religions that are already around have dealt with. I mean, they've pretty much dealt with everything. Anything that you would want to include in your new religion, you're probably going to find it's already been done. You know, maybe the best advice is if you read books. You know, study the traditions that are already there. You'll probably be amazed. My God, they were dealing with that issue? Yeah, it ain't new, man. You know, there's nothing really that new going on, you know, that hasn't already been thought of. So anyway, that'd be my advice.
Actually, I agree with Matt. I mean, you know, I think all of us when we're like 17 discovered that the space of making love has actually been fully explored. And I think, you know, in a way, you're absolutely right. The religious traditions have explored the whole space of making love in a different sense of it. But also, I think there's a really interesting point just came up with Colleen and John and Jordan. I think there was this kind of, I don't know, tendency in science to think it's all out there, it's objective, and so on and so forth, we're just finding it. And you know the way when you're a kid, like you're 3 years old or something, and you get the bathtub and you get the waves going at just the right speed, and then they all pile up on this wall, and then they all pile up, and it's such fun, except it turns out there's a big splash and your parents are kind of upset. But I kind of think that with respect to the sort of contribution that we as people are making to what it is that we're learning about the world, I think that we pile all the water up on the other side of the bathtub at the moment. So we've gone from thinking it's all there, independent of us, to a kind of fantasy that we're all making it up, that we make up the meaning, we produce knowledge. You know, I think this idea of the production of knowledge, I think it's a terribly unfortunate fact at the university. For among other reasons, it hands the university into a factory model so the province can decide how productive we're being, how many units of knowledge are we producing every 3 days and stuff. And I think what you're talking about, so I'm just agreeing with all of you, I think it's profoundly relational. And I think we have to be really careful not to inadvertently cater to this current fetishization of it being we make the meaning up, we make the knowledge up, and all this kind of stuff. I think we need to give a little credit back to the world. End of homily. Sort of slash, right, end of, or slash homily.
Well, I really agree with you. I mean, the secret deal that was made between rationalism and romanticism was that idea that we're the makers. We're the sole makers from the side of subjectivity alone. And I think romanticism was one of the great disasters that needs to be put along with the critique we're making of rationalism.
Okay, if there are any final thoughts on that, we could hear them, but I think other than that, we should probably wrap up. Okay, so we're going to have quick closing remarks, but just before that, I'll have Kaya come down for 1 second. And during that, let's thank our panel. Yes.